Namaskar teachers. Today we will talk about storytelling as a pedagogical tool. Story is defined as a context enriched by emotions. Traditionally, it is through story that important, meaningful information has been passed down through the generations. Factual information, so readily available to us through electronic media, lacks the emotional impact of stories. Emotion, we need to understand, is the critical element that makes information relevant and memorable. Stories promote lively imagination on the part of the students. When students listen to a story, they create in their mind pictures and visualizations. They make inferences and predictions and fill in the missing gaps. They, in a sense, become involved in creating the story, thus forming a relationship with the narrative. When packaged as a story, the oral delivery of information promotes greater involvement than it does with a written language. Teaching storytelling also teaches communication, writing, and presentation skills. Using storytelling as a method of instruction and assessment supports educational objectives. These include improving verbal skills, getting self-confidence, discovering the meaning of events, developing a love for the language and stories, encouraging higher levels of cognitive thinking, getting more depth of understanding of the narration, and of course, improving one's imaginative skills. And most importantly, it also encourages students in actively participating in the creation of more similar kind of stories. Now, storytelling is such an effective tool for teachers because it is a powerful form of communication. Both the student and the teacher benefit from it immensely. Students learn from hearing stories because they pay closer attention and understand the message more easily and retain the key points longer. Teachers become better educators because being able to tell a story effectively enhances a perception of the teacher as a leader. So it's a win-win situation for both the parties. You see, a teacher who can adeptly tell a tale reveals an approachable, likable, and more human side to his or her personality. This helps to close the distance between the teacher and the student by making the teacher status less threatening. So, students become more friendly and the teacher appears to be more approachable. As a result, a conducive learning environment can be established in the class. If we take up storytelling as an important pedagogical tool in our everyday teaching method. Now the question comes as to why we should take up storytelling. Why is storytelling as a pedagogical tool a very important thing? Now the reasons are that first and foremost it creates a sense of connection. So you see, when you tell stories or maybe when you share your personal experiences, it helps you to create connection with your students. There might be a few students who may relate to that connection and they identify to the characters of the story much better. Now, storytelling also helps in building curiosity and imagination skills. So, if you tell students stories in a very effective manner, it helps them to become creative, develop imaginative skills, and more importantly, when you leave a story in a cliffhanger, it makes them more and more curious to know what is going to happen next. So a very good interaction can be established through this particular form of teaching. Now, it also helps students to remember things better since it is not entirely textual or based on the curriculum. Students are diverted from the monotonous way of the chalk and board method, so stories become a very important way how students can remember things and it helps them to improve their retention ability. Also, it makes listeners more open to listening. Now, listening is a very important skill. Sometimes in this fast pace, we forget the importance of listening. So the practice of telling stories enhances these listening skills among students. So they become more receptive, they become more patient, and of course they become very good listeners. Other than this, we also see using storytelling as a pedagogical tool in teaching, it conveys complex ideas into simple forms. So a complex thought can be broken down in a simpler way. Maybe a particular message or a moral that is very complex or deep can be broken down in a simple way by telling stories. Also, it keeps the listeners engaged. So if your listeners and your students are engaged, so controlling your class, the class discipline, and handling the students with a lot of enthusiasm and energy becomes much easier. It helps them to stay focused, it channelizes their energy, and the class environment as a whole becomes a very conducive place that fosters learning in a meaningful way. Now, when preparing one's notes for a class lesson, a teacher decides how best to present the material. Now consider packaging the information in form of a story rather than a lecture. When deciding how to help the student to process information or to assess what students have learned, consider having the students recreate the information in form of a story and then tell it. So if you do this exercise, it will really help you in the learning process. Because you are not just by telling story giving an idea of the chapter, but you are also actively engaging students in this entire teaching and learning method. Here are some ways that storytelling can be applied to the classroom setting. First, create a story to illustrate new concepts or ideas. So if you have any concept, whether be it any subject, it can have a multidisciplinary approach as well. So create a story. First, create a story to illustrate new concepts or ideas. So if you have any new concept, whether be it any subject, it can have a multidisciplinary approach as well. So create a story to illustrate a new concept and ideas. Express a topic or theme by narrating a story about it. Now, if in literature, if you talk about a story that deals with war, you can create a parallel story to create the mood and create the vibe of the class as to what wars really are. And you can refer to some stories that can introduce a chapter in a more meaningful way. So it really helps students to get their attention and calm down and helps them to focus with the lecture that will proceed thereafter. Similarly, explaining historical events by narrating them as stories helps students to remember the historical facts better, invent and tell the story of historical figures, meeting one another and about characters from different stories meeting each other up. So this is a very interesting way how you can engage student participation. If you see the current sample papers of the board, especially in classes 10th and 12th, these kind of extrapolative questions and creative thinking skills are integrated in the question paper where students are encouraged to write answers. They are encouraged to think and imagine a situation where two characters from two different stories meet and discuss issues or ideas. So such kind of stories become very important to help students develop that thinking and creative skills. Now put knowledge that needs to be assessed in a narrative form and invite the students to tell the story to the teacher and the class. Take a familiar story and retell it with characters and situations based on the curriculum material. Now if you take up the story of the sermon at Banaras of class 10th, where Buddha gives a particular sermon in Banaras about life and death, if that story can be taken as an example, use the characters in a different setting and maybe you can ask the students to create a story with a different kind of sermon that Buddha might want to give. So that is important for life. So if that kind of questions are introduced in the class and such kind of stories are encouraged from the students, you get a very active participation and a very conducive learning environment. Also, place yourself in a familiar story and narrate the event from your first person point of view. So like, let me quote an example of class 12th, the lost spring, and one of the character over there is Sahib. So you can ask a student to imagine themselves or imagine himself or herself to be Sahib-e-Alam and write the story from his or her point of view. How would he or she behave or how would he react and respond if he was playing the character of Sahib-e-Alam or he was the one interacting with Anish Jung, who is the author of the story. Such kind of imagination helps students to develop their thinking skills and of course helps them with creative writing. As a pedagogical tool, teachers should use storytelling to explore the cultural diversity, to survey storytelling methods, to discover a variety of ways to create stories, to integrate the curriculum, to foster imagination, and to investigate the power of narrative. Stories go beyond the mere presentation of facts. Instead, they involve the students by engaging the imagination and promoting conceptual connection to the information being presented. It is not just one way delivery of a fact or of an incident. It is a completely integrated approach where students and teachers, they connect with one particular narrative and they all relate to it in a meaningful way. There is an emotional connect that helps with the entire learning process. So now, when you create stories, when you use storytelling as a tool, what are the 4 things that you should keep in mind? So the 4 most important factors that should be there in any story are listed as 4 P's. So the first P is people. In stories, you have to create characters. They can be people, they can be animals that talk like people, like in Panchatantra stories or fables, but there has to be characters. So the first P is people. It helps to engage students, it helps to engage readers, it helps you to engage with the listeners because people add that very crucial element of connectivity. The second P that is important is the place. The story has to be set at a place, there has to be a background on which the story is developed. So why a place is important? It helps people to relate to the narrative. It can be a real place, it can be an imaginative place, it can be completely out of your dreamland, but there has to be a place where people can connect, people can understand, and most importantly, if it is imaginative, people can visually imagine the place as to how it really looks like. So if you talk about the world of Harry Potter as an example, although Hogwarts is not a reality, but people usually have a very vivid description and imagination of the place because of the storytelling. The weaving of the plot has been done so significantly and beautifully by J.K. Rowling that people connect to it very well. So that is the power of place when it is described beautifully in a narrative of a story. Now the third P that is important is the plot. It is one of the most important part. Every story should have a plot. It should start from a point and end at a point. It should have an introduction, it should have a closure, and of course a conclusion. The story can end at a cliffhanger because sometimes it is a style that generates attention, but there has to be a purpose. There has to be a build up of the tempo. It should end at a particular point or at a cliffhanger so that the reader continues listening or reading a story. So plot is very important. It can be some kind of conflict and resolution, victory of good over evil, it can be anything that you want, but there has to be a meaningful plot for a story to be effective. The last but not the least, the fourth P is a purpose as to why you are telling the story. There has to be a message, there has to be a moral. If there is no particular moral, there has to be a purpose as to why you told the story to the class. There has to be some takeaway from every story that you create, that you share. Maybe you want the student to realize something. Maybe you want the student to feel an experience, or you share your experience so that they can connect as to how it really was. There has to be a purpose to a story that you introduce in a classroom. Now the question comes that how can we involve the students in this activity, or how can we involve storytelling as a pedagogical tool to make learning more effective? Now there are many ways as to how we can do that, but broadly speaking, the first and the foremost, especially it happens with languages, you see, whether be it English, whether be it Hindi, whether be it Bengali or any major language that a student might have, get them to play the characters. You can design role play activities, you can help them to perform a skit, you can introduce a concept of Nukkad Natak and street plays. Help them to play characters in that way they can remember the plot. That way they learn the important dialogues, and much of the task of the teacher is already done because essential elements of learning and retention is already achieved, and students can remember the narrative, the plot, the stories, the characters and the incidents in a more significant way. One such example is Julius Caesar, that is there in the literary reader of class 10. When you use that as a chapter where students are given or assigned characters, and when they learn those lines and they enact it on stage, they emote the emotions of the characters beautifully, and learning then becomes so much fun. The second thing that teachers can do in class is that they can encourage students to be reflective and encourage them to ask extrapolative questions, or teachers themselves can ask them extrapolative questions. Help students to imagine, ask them questions where they themselves project to be in the shoe of those particular characters, and they can imagine and share their point of view, their point of information and their point of experience. Such kind of reflective questions are a part, as I told you earlier, of the assessment module of the board from the last academic year. So when you introduce such characters, like if I give you the example of maybe Amanda in class 10th, that is there in English literature and language, if Amanda is one character meeting Bholi, another character of a different story, so if these two characters meet, so what kind of conversation they would have? They are two completely different chapters, two different entities and characters, but both of them are very different. Like if I talk about Sahib-e-Alam from the story Law Spring meeting Mukesh, although they are from the same chapter, they are different characters. What kind of conversation they would have about their own cities? So if such kind of imaginative questions are introduced where children are reflective, it really helps them to boost their creative thinking skills, and when they present, when they write it, it boosts their writing skills as well. So please, as teachers, encourage your students to be creative, to be reflective, and give them an option of such extrapolative questions where teachers can introduce such concepts and students can learn in a more effective way. Now there is one more thing, that's one of my very favorite activities that can be done in class to encourage the students, that is suggest them an alternative ending to a story. You may ask them to give a different title to a poem they have read or modify the poem's very end. Maybe they can do it through a limerick, but encourage them to create such kind of exercises. It really helps your students to develop their speaking, develop their writing and develop their cognitive skills. Most importantly, it helps them to be a very reflective person. So to sum it up, you see, storytelling can be a very effective tool to inculcate the values of good listening skills, to inculcate and teach the students the importance of thinking, writing, and obviously boost their confidence and speaking skills. Use this as a pedagogical tool and see your class and your students transform. Namaskar.